So I've been doing a little work with hair lately and fur, and I thought it might be good to just create a really quick walkthrough of how to set up a couple of different types of hair. So basically all you need first is a model. And the important thing about the model is it really doesn't matter whether it's polygons or NURBS in Maya, as long as its UVs have been properly prepared. In the case of NURBS, you don't have to prepare the polygons because basically if it's NURBS, its UVs are pretty much laid out relative to how you treated the surface. Now with polygons on the other hand, you're usually going to have to edit your UVs, at least so that you actually have every face represented and proportionally laid out within the UV space. Okay, so I'm using a primitive sphere just because it's already laid out. And so once you have your sphere, you can delete your history on it. You can go to Dynamics, or if you have a newer version of Maya, you want to go to N Dynamics. I'm working in Maya 2015 right now. Okay, so I'm going to create hair. So go to the N hair, and I can create hair. Okay, so that is pretty much the basic way to just generally create hair. And then of course you can use various tools such as like scale hair, so you can style it a little bit. But if you actually want to create hair with a very specific shape, you can actually do something a little different. Whenever you create hair in this fashion, it's actually using NURBS curves to control how each one of these little clumps of hair is actually behaving. So for example, if I actually select the hair and I go to N hair and I tell it to display, and I tell it to display all curves. Okay, so it didn't really see anything happen, and that's because in my interface right now I'm actually hiding curves. But if I actually show curves, then we can actually see the curves that are controlling, or those hairs. So each one of these hairs is basically in control of the clump. If I press play now, you actually see that we have our hairs deforming, and we have our NURBS curves staying stiff. And that's because these are the original curves which were used to generate the hair. If you actually go to your outliner, and you expand the hair system follicles folder, then you'll actually see the follicles and then basically the curves which actually control the default state. Now of course if you want to, you could select one of these curves and you could actually modify it, and in modifying it, modify the appearance of the associated clump. For example, I've selected just one curve and I've selected its CVs, and now if I actually deform it, you can see it'll actually change what the hair is actually looking like. It changes the shape of the hair. So when I rewind, you can see that that clump is now shaped like the NURBS curve. So if you wanted to, you could go through to each one of these hairs, make changes to it, so you could actually customize the appearance of basically the entire head of hair. Very tedious, but it does get the job done in a fashion. Now there are other ways to actually do this so that you don't have to necessarily go back or have to depend on the default curves to basically modify your hair. You could just basically create the curves first and then generate the hair based on those curves. So if I went in and let's say I'll remove the hair system entirely. So I'm going to select the hair, go to N hair and tell it to delete entire hair system. Okay, so it deletes all the follicles, everything like that. It still leaves the default nucleus, which is fine. Okay, but now we're back to our default sphere. So if I wanted to create some custom hair for this, I'm just going to choose an angle. I'm going to my right view. I'm going to create, and I'll just keep it very simple. I'll use the EP curve tool. And I'll just come in and I'll just make, let's say, a little ponytail. And I'll give it an interesting shape, just so that once we do have some hair, it'll also look interesting. Okay, so there's a curve. And let's say that's it. Okay. And I'm just going to name this just so we know what it is. It's going to be my original curve. So now with that curve selected, I can come in and go to N hair, and I can go down to where it says Assign Hair System. Now there's no existing hair system. And since there is no existing hair system, I can just create a new one with that curve selected. And so immediately when I do that, you can see that it generates a new set of nodes and objects. For example, now we have a follicle attached to our curve, attached to our original. Okay, and we also have a output curve, which is basically our dynamic curve. So if I rewind the timeline and just play a bit, you can actually see that one curve is actually dynamic and it just drapes down. And then we have the original curve, which is still in control of what the hair is going to look like. I can select it, select its CVs, make some adjustments, and as you can see, the dynamic curve will update to respond to the changes in the original curve, in the source curve, which can be very, very useful. So now that we actually do have a hair system on here, we can select the hair system in our outliner and go to End Hair, and we can tell it to, we can add a paint effects brush to the hair. And what this will do is it'll basically create a clump based on the original curve. So now if I switch back to my perspective view, we can see that it follows the curve perfectly. And of course it needs a little cleanup and modification just to style the hair a bit. And all you have to do is select the hair, go into your attribute editor, go to the hair system shape, and you can start styling your hair simply by going to, or continue to style your hair, by going to the clump and hair shape, where you can actually determine how many hairs are generated along that curve. You can specify subsections, which is basically going to smooth out some of those jagged sections that you could actually see there in the original creation. And then there's clump width, of course. So you can adjust the width of your clump or the default width of your clump. There is actually another way to adjust that width. And then there's the general hair width for basically the thickness of an individual strand, which you can test simply by doing a quick test render. Now, usually the default thickness is not so great, depending on the scale of your model. So you usually need to go in and test this stuff and tweak it. Now, generally when it comes to working with hair, you want to keep the clump complexity. It's basically the hairs per clump fairly low until you're actually ready to output the final version of it, where you're going to need a little more density in most cases. But generally you want to keep it light while you're fine-tuning things, just so it's a little easier on your computer's processor. It's a little faster. Now we've got hair width, which is already fairly fine, but then we also have these ramps which actually control the hair as well. And so they can go from minimal to maximum, and you can actually even do things like this, where you can actually have it narrower at one end and thicker in the middle. So you can actually have a lot of fun and get a lot of interesting looks just by playing with these settings. Okay, so let's say I want it to be a little more bulgy at the top. So I can do something like this. Okay, and that way it narrows towards the ends. And now the hair scale itself, this is basically the hair width, the thickness of the individual hairs. Simply just bring this down, and you usually want the end of it to be fairly thin. And this way, if I did another test render, you can actually see that we're starting to look more realistic. I could even go a little thinner with the hair. And it looks like I need to add a few more subsections just so it's a little smoother in there as well. Okay, then of course you have flatness and our interpolation range. These are all things you can play around with. If you actually tweak flatness, it pretty much just generally tries to flatten things out, so it's not a rounded clump, it'll basically be a flatter clump. Or let's say you're trying to create bangs, you need that hair that's running along the front of the head to basically be a little more flat, not so rounded, the clump. You can just increase the flatness so you can actually get that style. Okay, and of course, like anything, you can actually vary it so that maybe in the middle, so at the end it's actually very round, but then in the middle it starts to flatten out. I mean, it just depends on what style you're trying to create. And if you don't want any flatness at all, just leave it all the way at 0. Another part of styling, of course, is going to be using the shading. And the hair, general hair color, you can assign that here. And let's say I want to make the hair yellow, just that simple. And then, of course, you have your hair color scale, and this is going to determine how the light actually affects the hair overall. So this is the base of the hair, this is the tip of the hair, and of course this is the middle. So depending on what shades you put in here and basically how light they are, how dark they are, it's actually going to influence, again, the way the hair looks. So if I actually put red in here, then we actually get a red bleeding into our yellow. Okay, so you can actually really style your hair in very interesting ways using just a combination of settings. You can actually see those changes have taken effect in the final output as well. Okay. Now, besides some of your basic styling and creation methods, if let's say you have your ponytail, but let's say you actually want more hair, or you want to create more specific styles in different areas of the head, again, you can just create another curve, and you could even assign it to the same system. Let's say I even take that original curve. Okay, I select it, I'm going to duplicate it, and now I'm just going to rotate that duplicate so that it's in a slightly different angle from the original. I'll scale it down a bit. Okay, and then I'll just pull it up so it's closer to the top of the head, and then maybe scale it a little more so it's not so inside of the head there. Okay, so I've made yet another curve, and I've made a few more changes to it, just so we're going to have a little more hair here. Okay, and I'll duplicate that one more time, and I'll actually rotate it the opposite direction, so 27 degrees the opposite direction. And now if I actually select these two hair curves, and I'll actually just freeze transform their scale. Okay, so that's going to be their default scale. With those selected, I can go to N hair, and I can assign hair system, and I'll assign it the existing hair system. So basically what it'll do is it'll assign that hair styling and that hair clump system to our extra curve. So now we actually have 3 custom curves with the same style. Now, if you decide that you want these other curves to have a different style, all you have to do is select those curves and go to N hair and assign a new hair system. When you assign a new hair system, then you're going to have to actually go through and restyle some of those new hairs. It just depends on what you want to do. So don't forget, if you are going to assign a new hair system to your new custom curves, you go to N hair, assign hair system, new hair system. Once you have your new hair system, you'll see that it will generate another set of output curves. And while you still have your hair system selected, you can go to N hair and tell it to assign paint effects brush to that hair. And then you have to style your new hair all over again. Okay? And this way you can have different behaviors for each clump. For example, if you want the ponytail to be dynamic, but you didn't want your new hair system to be dynamic, you could simply go to your new hair system and disable its dynamic capabilities. So hair system 2, and all I have to do is go to the attribute editor and go to the hair system shape for that clump, which is hair system shape 2, and I can go to the very top, and where it says simulation method, I just set that to static, and now that one won't move. I could also disable the nucleus, so it's not using the nucleus at all. So it shouldn't respond at all to any dynamics, while our original ponytail, as you can see, is completely dynamic. Okay, and last but not least, very important, how do you get your hair to actually follow the geometry? If you're actually creating custom curves, then when you actually move the geometry, the hair will not follow it. Okay? When you actually use the create hair option, it actually attaches everything so that it will just follow along with wherever the geometry goes. But when you create custom curves on your own and create paint effects on those, you're going to have to tell them to follow. And that's as simple as doing a couple of different things. You can do one of these two things. If you want to, you can just take the hair system follicle groups for each one of your custom hairs and basically just constrain them to the head of your character, like its rig, not to the geometry itself, but to the rig. And that way when the head moves, the hair stays aligned with the rig and therefore with the head. Simple. Or whatever body part you're creating hair for. Another option is select, if you can actually show, you can do what I did before, select your hair, go to display, show all of the curves, and then select the original curves, and you could bind those original curves to the joint in the head. Wherever those original curves go, just like however you deform them, wherever they go, wherever they move, the paint effects and the dynamic hair will follow. So those are a couple of different ways you can make sure that you create your custom hair and also get it to follow.